Hello, this is Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, RCAF USA, the organization, was formed 2 decades ago and has earned the reputation of being aggressive, forceful, and committed to reversing the present trajectory of the U.S. cattle industry. Our positions are viewed as highly controversial by conventional farm and ranch organizations, even those that purport to support some of our initiatives. We've been highly critical of U.S. trade policies, arguing they benefit multinational corporations at the expense of independent cattle producers and the rural communities they support. We've warned America for years that the current structure of our U.S. cattle industry, marked by highly concentrated markets and corporate control, is vulnerable to dysfunction, such as that now evidenced from the COVID-19 pandemic. We've warned consumers that they're being duped into believing the beef they buy for their families is all U.S. produced beef, when in fact it's likely to be imported beef regardless of what the label says. We've warned cattle producers that if they acquiesce to a government-mandated animal identification system, they are capitulating to the global effort to transfer control over the entire live cattle supply chain away from independent cattle producers and to a corporate government top-down authoritarian regime. And we warn cattle producers that their government-mandated checkoff dollars are being spent to further consolidate and vertically integrate their industry, which is eroding their marketing opportunities, their liberty, and their freedom to remain independent cattle ranchers. Now, these are fighting words for conventional organizations like the North American Meat Institute and the National Cattle and Beef Association, and for good reason. We collectively call these groups the meatpacking lobby because they represent the world's largest beef packers. And it wasn't always that way, but the packers figured out they could best control the U.S. cattle industry if they first controlled the organizations that represented all of the industry participants. That's why the Packers Trade Association, the Beef Industry Council, merged with the National Cattlemen's Association to become the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, or NCBA, back in the mid-90s. Now, we're not so naive to think that the important reforms that we are seeking will benefit everyone involved in the U.S. cattle industry. Obviously, if you're a cattle producer whose business model includes passing over U.S. cow-calf producers in favor of purchasing cheap Mexican feeder cattle, you will not like the policy initiatives of RCAF USA. No, our policy initiatives will interfere with your self-interest, particularly your interest to buy cheap imports and sell the resulting beef to unsuspecting consumers as beef that is exclusively produced in the United States. Also, those whose business model includes importing cheaper Canadian cattle and exporting the beef as a product of the USA will likewise object to mandatory country of origin labeling, along with our efforts to stop the practice of considering all beef produced in U.S. packing plants to be a domestic product. No, our policies are not for those folks, and there are quite a few of them. Now, that's obvious by the fact that we import about 2 million cattle a year from Canada and Mexico. Even if each importer imported only 1,000 head of Mexican or Canadian cattle a year, that's about 2,000 U.S. cattle operations that favor imported cattle over domestic cattle. Now, guess which organizations they belong to? It's certainly not RCAF USA. Even though those whose self-interests are best served by the status quo are actually in a minority, their interests are disproportionately influential because they belong to the oldest and largest cattle association that combines their self-interests with the self-interests of the multinational beef packers, who are now members of the same group. And unsurprisingly, the interests of the beef packers and the importers are exactly the same. And that's why our conventional trade association resists any of the reforms that RCAF USA is pursuing. And that's why if you want to preserve the opportunities for yourselves and your children and grandchildren, you must begin doing something different. You simply cannot continue supporting the organizations that should be representing your interests when you know they are not. We hope you'll take a critical look at the cattle associations who purport to represent the industry and decide for yourself which of those groups are really fighting for the independent producer. And then you must act. You must stop supporting the groups who are not on the front lines fighting for you, and you must begin supporting the group that is. If you do not, nothing, absolutely nothing will change. And this is the cold hard fact. We urge you to join RCAF USA. Please go to r-calfusa.com.